When a young girl wakes from a coma, the first words out of her mouth send chills down the nurse's spine. What seemed like a tragic fall at first takes a sinister turn as the pieces unravel, revealing a dark truth. One that puts her life and her family in unimaginable danger. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. The steady beeping of machines filled the quiet hospital room, a rhythmic pulse cutting through the sterile air. Emma Davenport stirred beneath the crisp white sheets, her eyelids fluttering open. For a brief moment her gaze was unfocused, lost in the blinding fluorescent lights above her. Then, as if a fog had suddenly lifted, her small body tensed, her breath hitched, her wide eyes darting around the unfamiliar surroundings before locking onto the nurse adjusting her IV. Nurse Ellen Monroe turned at the movement, her face shifting from professional to detachment, to open shock. "Sweetheart, you're awake," she breathed, pressing the call button with a shaky hand. "Stay calm." "Okay, I'm going to." Emma's fingers curled into the sheets, her voice rasping from months of disuse. "It wasn't an accident." Her lips trembled and the nurse took a step closer. "He pushed me." A beat of silence stretched between them. Ellen's face went pale, her breath catching in her throat. Emma's wide eyes pleaded for someone to believe her, her tiny frame trembling beneath the hospital gown. Without a word, the nurse turned on her heel and hurried out of the room, her shoes tapping urgently against the floor. Emma was left alone, her whispered words still hanging in the air, the weight of them sinking into the sterile quiet. The hospital corridor bustled with activity, but inside Emma's room, an eerie hush had settled. The door creaked open, and a tall figure stepped inside, her Uncle Robert Davenport. He moved forward with practiced ease, his expression one of concern. "Sweetheart," he murmured, her voice strained. "You're awake?" The girl's gaze flicked between them, confusion clouding her features. She had expected her father to be there, maybe holding her hand, reassuring her that everything would be okay, but he wasn't. Robert took a seat beside the bed, his tone gentle but firm. "You've been asleep for a long time," he said. "But you're safe now. The doctor said you're going to make a full recovery." The girl swallowed, her throat raw. "Where's Dad?" Silence stretched between them. Her mother averted her gaze while Robert's feature tightened almost imperceptibly. "He's not here right now," her mother finally said, her hands twisting together. "We'll talk about it later." The girl's stomach churned. Something wasn't right. Even in her groggy state, she could sense the tension clinging to the air like static. Her uncle reached for her hand, his grip firm but strangely rehearsed. "You don't have to worry about anything," he assured her. "I'll handle everything." But that was exactly what worried her. The arrival of the detective was both abrupt and inevitable. By the time Emma had been awake for a few hours, whispers had spread through the hospital halls. A child waking from a coma was newsworthy enough. A child waking from a coma and accusing someone of pushing her, that was something else entirely. Detective Ryan Carter stepped into the room with the careful scrutiny of someone who had seen more than his fair share of tragedies. He was tall, his dark eyes assessing Emma with quiet intensity. He didn't smile, didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, he pulled up a chair beside the bed and took out a small notebook. "I know you've been through a lot," he said, his voice steady, "but I need to ask you a few questions, if you're up for it." The girl hesitated, her fingers tightening around the blanket. Robert stood nearby, his arms crossed, his presence looming in a way that made the detective gaze flick toward him briefly before returning to the child. She nodded hesitantly. "Can you tell me what happened?" Carter's tone remained neutral, giving her space to answer. The girl licked her lips, her voice quieter this time. "I remember being at home. I was upstairs, and then—" "I don't know," I failed, her brows knitted together as she struggled to recall. "But it wasn't an accident," she swallowed hard. "Someone pushed me." Carter jotted something down in his notebook. "Did you see who it was?" A frown flickered across her face. The memory felt like something just out of reach. Blurred at the edges. I don't know." Robert let out a low exhale. "She's been through enough," he interjected smoothly. "Maybe we should let her rest." Carter didn't look at him, his focus still on Emma, of course, but "I'll need to speak with her again soon." He rose from his seat, tucking his notebook away. "I'll also be reviewing the initial case file. There are some inconsistencies I need to look into." The girl barely noticed the detective, leaving her mind spinning. Inconsistencies, she had felt it too. The moment she opened her eyes, something wasn't adding up. And The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became someone didn't want her to remember. The staircase stretched before Emma like an endless drop, the cold banister pressed against her palm, a shiver creeping up her spine. She had been there before, 3 months ago, but the memory was fractured, slipping through her grasp like sand. She could hear echoes of voices, not words but tones, sharp and urgent. Then a shadow moved behind her. She had no memory of falling, just the sensation of weightlessness. Then, nothing. The official report was straightforward: a tragic ACD accident. A child's misstep. The housekeeper had found Emma sprawled at the base of the stairs. Unmoving by the time the ambulance arrived, she was slipping into unconsciousness. A 3-month coma. The police report lacked depth. A generic summary of a misfortune that required no further investigation. The house was a family estate full of security cameras meant to provide a clear answer to any doubts. Yet, the footage from that night was gone, wiped clean. The system had recorded up until 2 hours before the fall, then resumed the next morning, as though nothing had happened. A technical failure, they called it. To make matters worse, a few days after Emma's accident, her parents vanished at the same time. No one saw them leave. No one knew where they went. It was as if they had simply been erased. And no one could explain why Robert had been the only one left to pick up the piece. He had taken charge of the situation. Immediately ensuring that Emma had everything she needed, he had spoken to the police, pushing them to take another look at the case. He had even hired a private investigator. At least, that's what it looked like on the surface. Something about his concern felt rehearsed, as if he knew exactly what to say, when to say it. He had the right amount of frustration with the lack of answers, the right level of protectiveness over his niece. But there were small things: the way he dismissed certain theories too quickly, the way he deflected conversations away from specific details. The private investigator he hired didn't last long. The man had been thorough, asking questions no one else had thought to ask. He had started pulling at threads, tracking down staff members, trying to piece together what happened that night. Then abruptly he stopped. The investigator refused to take further meetings. Calls went unanswered. The file he had been compiling disappeared, and with it any real chance of finding the truth. Who really pushed Emma down the stairs? And why? What really happened to her parents? Drop your theories in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and keep watching to uncover the truth. The police file was thin, filled with generic notes and formal conclusions. Emma's parents were missing, that much was clear. Beyond that, the details were infuriatingly vague. Detective Ryan Carter sat at his desk, flipping through the reports again. According to the official investigation, James Davenport had likely disappeared for financial reasons. Some early speculation suggested he had fled the country, evading legal trouble. Yet, the deeper Carter dug, the more obvious it became. There was no trail of debt, no secret accounts, no signs of fraud. The father's finances were intact. If he left, it wasn't to escape something monetary. Claire, Emma's mother, was an even bigger mystery. She had no history of instability, no close friends who might have helped her leave, no reason to vanish without explanation. If she was running, what was she running from? Then there was the cell phone data. Both parents' phones had last been active in the same location before going dark within minutes of each other. It didn't make sense if they had disappeared together. Why was there no ransom, no message, no demand? People didn't just vanish like that, unless someone made sure they did. Emma sat across from the therapist, her fingers gripping the edge of the couch cushion. She hated these sessions. The way the room was always too quiet. The way the woman across from her spoke softly, as if afraid she might shatter. But today was different. Today something was pushing at the edges of her mind, a flicker of memory she had buried deep. I was on the stairs, she said, slowly testing the words. I remember looking down, and then her brow furrowed. I wasn't alone. The therapist leaned forward slightly. Can you see who was there? Emma shook her head, frustration tightening her chest. No, it's blurry. The memory, twisted inside her, just out of reach. She could hear something now. A voice. It wasn't clear, but there was anger behind it, a sharp tone, a heated argument somewhere nearby. I heard someone fighting, she murmured down the hall. The therapist made a note, but didn't interrupt. The girl's breathing came quicker. I turned around, she said, squeezing her hands into fists. And then I don't know, it's like she exhaled sharply. I fell. The therapist's gaze was calm, but her words carried weight. It's possible your memory will return in fragments, she said. It might not come all at once, but when it does, you need to be careful. If someone doesn't want you to remember, that could mean you're still in danger. The estate had once been a symbol of wealth and tradition, but now it carried a different presence. A house filled with unanswered questions. Detective Carter had spent the last hour speaking with former staff, piecing together accounts from the night of the accident. Most of them had little to offer. The ones who might have known something had been let go in the months that followed, scattered without explanation. Then came the housekeeper. She was older, her hands worn from years of work, her expression hesitant. She had been there that night. She had heard things. There was shouting. She said, finally, not just an argument, something worse. Carter didn't rush her. I remember hearing footsteps, someone moving fast. I looked, but by the time I reached the hallway, whoever it was already gone. Did you see anything else? She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone else might be listening. Then she nodded. There was a key, she said. I found it the next morning. It didn't belong to any of the doors in the house. I was going to turn it in, but before I could, it disappeared. A key, a missing piece in a puzzle that was already too tangled. Carter left the estate with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: someone had been working hard to make sure the past stayed buried. The morning shift change at the hospital came and went, but Nurse Ellen Monroe never arrived. It wasn't like her. She was meticulous, always on time, never missing a shift without calling by noon. Whispers had begun circulating among the staff by evening. She was officially reported missing. Detective Ryan Carter leaned against his car outside the hospital, flipping through the nurse's personnel file. She had been the first to hear Emma's words after she woke from her coma, the first to react with genuine fear. Now she had vanished. He exhaled slowly, scanning the printed pages, until his phone buzzed, a call from one of his contacts in surveillance. You're going to want to see this, the voice said. The security footage was grainy but clear enough. At 5:48 a.m., Monroe had stepped out of her apartment building, walking toward her car. A black sedan pulled up alongside her. She barely had time to react before a man in dark clothing stepped out, grabbed her by the arm and forced her inside the car, sped away before the camera could catch the plate number. Carter clenched his jaw. Someone had made sure she wouldn't talk back at the hospital. He found Emma sitting upright in bed, her small hands twisted in the sheets. She had heard the whispers, the missing posters, the way the nurses avoided looking her in the eye. Is she gone because of me? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Carter crouched beside the bed, his voice steady. This isn't your fault. But the look in her eyes said she didn't believe him, and deep down neither did he. It started with an offhand comment. Emma had been lying in bed staring at the ceiling when she mumbled, "My rabbit." Carter glanced up from his notebook. Your rabbit. She nodded toward the small stuffed animal resting near the foot of the bed. I had it that night. I remember holding it. Something about the way she said it made Carter reach for the plush toy. He turned it over in his hands, fingers pressing into the seams. Then beneath the fabric he felt something solid. Carefully he ripped open the seam along the back, and a small metal object tumbled into his palm. A key. He held it up to the light. It was old, with an unusual insignia etched into its surface, ornate but not decorative, functional, specific. Emma watched him, her brow furrowed. That was in my rabbit, Carter nodded. You must have hidden it before you fell. He pocketed the key and made a call to an old locksmith contact. The man recognized the symbol immediately. That's not a house key, he said. That's used for old security compartments, custom jobs, usually hidden locks. You see these in places where people don't want things found. Carter glanced at Emma, his mind already piecing things together. Someone had gone through great lengths to erase the truth, but she had unknowingly kept a part of it safe. The first sign that someone was watching him came when Carter found the envelope on his windshield. It was unmarked, the paper crisp inside a single sheet of paper with a typed message, "Walk away." Carter read it twice, then tore it in half. Meanwhile, Robert was moving fast. Legal documents had surfaced suggesting he was in the process of securing power over the family's estate. The way things were going, within weeks he would control everything: assets, property, decision-making. He was positioning himself as the authority over Emma's future. Carter didn't trust it. The speed, the convenience, it felt orchestrated at the hospital. Emma sat cross-legged on her bed, staring at nothing in particular. I keep remembering things, she said. Suddenly Carter stood at the hospital and saw on one of the beds, staring at nothing in particular. I keep remembering things, she said. Suddenly, Carter said in a frightened voice. I keep remembering things, she said. Suddenly Carter stood at the hospital and saw on one of the beds, staring at nothing in particular. Pulled up a chair. What kind of thing? She chewed on her lip, hesitant. The voices that night. I heard something before I fell. I think they were talking about my dad. Carter's pulse ticked up a notch. Do you remember what they said? She shook her head. Not yet, but I think it was bad. The fragments of memory were returning, and whatever she had overheard before her fall, someone had gone to great lengths to keep buried. Detective Ryan Carter adjusted his gloves as he stepped through the heavy double doors of the Davenport estate. The house loomed around him, grand but hollow, its opulence dulled by a lingering sense of secrecy. He had been here before, but this time he wasn't alone beside him. His longtime contact and investigator Michael Graves ran his fingers along the wooden paneling. If there's something hidden here, Graves muttered, it's not in plain sight. Carter pulled the small key from his pocket, its metal cool against his palm. The engraving was still unfamiliar, but the housekeeper's words echoed in his mind. A key that didn't fit any of the doors in the house. They moved through the study, checking furniture drawers and desk compartments. Then Carter's eyes landed on the large bookshelf in the far corner of the room. It looked solid, unmovable, but something was off. He pressed a hand against the wooden frame and felt a slight give. "Help me with this," he said. Graves wedged his fingers along the edge and pushed. A dull click sounded, followed by a groan of shifting wood. The bookshelf swung open, revealing a narrow, dust-covered passage. Carter flicked on his flashlight. The room beyond was small, barely large enough for two people to stand in comfortably. Stacks of old documents littered the shelves, along with safe deposit keys, aged journals, and at the center of the desk a single envelope, sealed, untouched, and addressed to James Davenport Carter. Exhaled. Looks like Emma's father had secrets of his own. But the bigger question remained. Had he been hiding something, or had he been trying to protect her from something much worse? The envelope's edges were crisp, the ink faded but legible. Carter ran a thumb along the seal before carefully tearing it open. Inside, the paper was yellowed with time, the handwriting steady, but urgent. "If anything happens to me, look inside the nursery. You'll find what you need there. He won't stop until they have what they want, and he won't care who gets hurt in the process. Keep Emma safe, James." The final word sent a chill through Carter's spine. He folded the letter, his jaw tightening. "Looks like he knew he was a target," Graves said, reading over his shoulder. Carter nodded. "And whatever he was protecting, it's in the nursery." He turned, already running through the layout of the house in his mind. If James had left something there, it meant he had been planning for this, and it meant that whoever had come after him had known it too. Carter barely had time to process the letter before his instincts flared. He wasn't a man who spooked easily, but as soon as he stepped into his apartment that night, he knew something was wrong. The air felt off too. Still, then he saw it. His office had been ransacked. Files were overturned, drawers left hanging open, papers littered the floor. But the most important ones, his notes on the case, the investigation into Emma's parents, were gone. His pulse remained steady as he scanned the room, searching for anything out of place. That's when he saw it. A single sheet of paper left deliberately on his desk. "Stop digging." Carter clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a warning. It was a message. Someone had been inside his home. Someone had been watching. Detective Ryan Carter had confronted enough liars in his career to know when someone was performing, and right now Robert was putting on a show. Seated across from him in the dimly lit office of the Davenport estate, the man exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if the mere suggestion offended him. "Detective, I don't know what you're implying, but I would never erase evidence. I've been trying to help Emma through all of this. The last thing I would do is hide the truth." Carter didn't blink. He rested his forearms on the desk, voice steady. "Then, explain why every piece of footage from the night of Emma's fall has conveniently disappeared, why security records are missing, why people connected to this case like her nurse are vanishing." Robert stiffened. It was slight, barely noticeable, but Carter caught it. "I have no idea," the man said after a beat, leaning back in his chair. "But if what you're saying is true, then I want answers just as badly as you do." A perfect line, rehearsed, controlled. The kind of response given by someone who had anticipated this conversation. Carter wasn't buying it. What he didn't know was that at that very moment a phone buzzed in Robert's pocket. A simple, unspoken instruction had already been sent. "Keep an eye on him. If he gets too close, take care of it." By the time Carter left the estate, his instincts were on high alert. He had no proof, yet he could feel it. Robert was orchestrating the cover-up back at the hospital. Emma sat up in bed, her gaze distant. She had been quiet since Carter arrived, the weight of everything pressing down on her. Carter took a seat at the edge of her bed. "Emma, I need you to be honest with me. Do you trust your uncle? Her brows furrowed. I don't know, she admitted. He acts like he cares, but sometimes it doesn't feel real. That was enough for Carter. Emma's dreams had been a swirling mess of broken images for weeks, but that night it all came together. She was standing at the top of the stairs. The air was thick with tension. Voices echoed from down the hall, angry, hushed. It has to look like an accident. I need them to disappear. Without a trace, no one can ever know. The words were sharp-edged with something cold. Then she turned and she was falling. Emma woke with a gasp, her hands gripping the sheets. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts. The voice, she had heard it before she knew it. Carter rushed in, drawn by the sound of her scream. Emma, talk to me, he said, kneeling beside her bed. She swallowed hard, her pulse still racing. I remember, she whispered. I don't know who, but I heard them. Someone wanted my parents gone. Ryan Carter parked a block away from the warehouse, cutting the engine, and letting the silence settle around him, he checked his watch. 10 minutes ahead of schedule. His contact had given him nothing but coordinates and a cryptic warning. You'll want backup. Grav sat beside him, eyes scanning the darkened street. You sure about this? No, Carter admitted. But we're out of time. The tip had come from a retired private investigator. One who had been hired months ago by Robert, before abruptly dropping the case that alone made Carter suspicious. The man hadn't given much, just a location and a single clue. They never left inside the warehouse. The air was thick with dampness and the smell of old wood. Carter moved cautiously through the narrow corridors, his flashlight casting long shadows across rusted metal shelves and abandoned machinery. Then he saw them. James and Claire Davenport sat against the far wall, their bodies slumped, hands loosely tied. The father barely moved, his breathing shallow. The mother lifted her head at the sound of footsteps, her eyes widened in recognition. It was him. She rasped, we trusted him. Carter crouched quickly, cutting the zip ties, who she swallowed, her throat dry. My brother, he did this. It wasn't a confirmation, not fully, but Carter already knew. Carter's flashlight swept across the room, landing on another figure in the corner. A woman, bound, her head drooping against her chest. At first he feared she was dead, but then she stirred, letting out a weak groan. His gut clenched. Ellen Monroe, the nurse. She had been missing for weeks now. She was here, barely conscious, but alive. Carter crouched beside her, carefully untying her wrists. Ellen, can you hear me? Her eyelids fluttered open, her gaze unfocused. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse but clear enough. They didn't want me to talk, she whispered. They said I knew too much. Robert had been one step ahead. The entire time, the operation was swift and precise. Within an hour, law enforcement had the warehouse surrounded, executing a well-planned raid. Carter stayed close to the scene, watching as officers secured the perimeter. Graves was the first to step out of the building, escorting Claire Davenport to safety. She'll be fine, he assured Carter, shaken but fine. James Davenport, however, had to be carried out. His body was weak, his face pale from dehydration and exhaustion. Carter kneeled beside the stretcher as paramedics worked to stabilize him. James's fingers curled weakly around Carter's sleeve. His voice was barely above a whisper. The nursery. Carter leaned in closer. What's in the nursery, James? A file, he gasped. It proves everything. Before Carter could press further, James's body gave out, his strength spent. The paramedics quickly loaded him into the ambulance nearby. Several of Robert's associates were being led away in cuffs, but Robert himself was nowhere to be found. Carter exhaled sharply. He had expected this. The man was too calculated, too cautious. He wouldn't have stayed behind to watch his plan crumble. He was still out there, and now he knew they were on to him. The game had just changed. Emma had spent so long convincing herself not to hope that, when she saw them, she could barely breathe. Her mother's arms wrapped around her, first tight, and, desperate as if she might disappear again if she let go, Emma's face was buried in her shoulder, her hands gripping the fabric of her mother's hospital gown. You're here, she choked out. We're here, sweetheart, Claire whispered. We're not leaving again. Her father was still weak, but he managed to reach for her hand, his grip light but steady. You kept fighting, he murmured. I knew you would. Tears burned the corners of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall, not yet. Across the room, Carter stood silently, giving them space. But when James caught his eye, the detective knew there was no time for sentimentality. The USB drive, James said, voice stronger now. It's in the nursery. Carter nodded. He already knew what came next. Robert wouldn't let them have that evidence. Time was running out. James Davenport was still weak, his skin pale under the hospital's fluorescent lights, but his grip was firm when he reached for Emma's hand. His voice, though quiet, carried urgency. "Remember what I told you before bedtime?" he said, his eyes locked on hers. Emma frowned. What James exhaled, his exhaustion weighing on him. "Think, sweetheart, every night when I tucked you in, I sang something to you." Her mind scrambled for the memory. It had been so long since she had heard it. Her father's voice, low and warm, singing softly. As he brushed the hair from her forehead, and then it came back, like an old melody, rising from deep in her mind. "Little star, little light hidden, safe and out of sight." She blinked, the words suddenly carrying a weight she'd never recognized before. Carter, who had been listening intently, straightened. "That's not just a lullaby, is it?" James gave a faint smile. "No, it's a location." Carter exchanged a look with Emma, his mind already working through the riddle. "Hidden, safe, and out of sight." "The nursery," Emma whispered. James nodded. "Find the safe. Everything you need is inside." The estate was dark. When Carter and Emma arrived, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. Carter had called Graves for backup, but they didn't have the luxury of waiting. If Robert realized what they were looking for, he wouldn't let them get to it first. Emma moved with purpose, leading Carter down the familiar hallway toward what used to be her nursery. The room had been untouched for years, a relic of the past. The furniture remained, though the air carried the scent of dust. At times she scanned the walls, her father's words playing over in her mind. "Little star, little light." Then she saw it, an old painting of the night sky hung above the crib. The stars, carefully arranged in a pattern she now recognized. Carter stepped closer, running his fingers along the frame until he felt an indentation. He pressed. A faint click echoed in the quiet room. The painting swung open, revealing a small metal compartment embedded in the wall. Emma's breath caught. Carter pulled the small key from his pocket, the one they had found in her stuffed animal. It fit perfectly. The lock turned, and the compartment door creaked open inside. Resting in the dust-lined compartment was a single USB drive. Carter picked it up, holding it between his fingers. "This is it." Emma's hands clenched at her sides. "We have to see what's on it." Carter nodded. He pulled out his laptop and inserted the drive. The screen flickered to life. A grainy video file opening. As it played, the images became clear. The staircase, Emma, and a figure standing behind her. Carter's stomach tightened as the moment played out. The shadowed figure reached out, then pushed Emma's small body, tumbled forward, the image cutting out just as she fell. Carter glanced at Emma, whose face had gone pale. "Do you know who that is?" She swallowed hard. "No, but I know that voice." The audio had captured the faintest whisper before, for the shove. No one can ever know. They didn't have to guess. The realization barely had time to settle before a crash echoed through the estate. The front door. Carter reacted instantly, snapping the USB drive shut and stuffing it into his pocket. "We need to move now." Emma's breath hitched. "Is it him?" Carter grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward the side exit. Not him, but his people. Heavy footsteps pounded through the hallways. Shadows moved beyond the nursery door, then the sound of splintering wood. Someone kicking through obstacles in their way. Carter yanked open a side door, ushering Emma through first before stepping into the corridor himself. But he wasn't fast enough. A massive figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking their path. Carter recognized him immediately. One Robert's hired enforcers, a man built like a wrecking ball, his hands clenched into fists. "You've been a pain in the ass, detective," the man muttered. Carter exhaled sharply. "Yeah, I get that a lot." Then the man lunged. Carter dodged the first swing barely, the force of it cracking into the wooden paneling behind him. He didn't wait for the second. Years of training took over as he countered with a sharp elbow to the ribs, then a knee to the gut. The enforcer staggered, but didn't go down. "Emma, run," Carter barked. She hesitated, but only for a second, before sprinting down the hall. Carter turned back just in time to catch a fist to the side of his face. Stars burst in his vision, pain spiking through his skull. He hit the floor, the weight of the man pressing down on him, but Carter wasn't out yet. Using the momentum, he twisted, knocking his attacker off balance just long enough to drive a hard kick into his knee. The man grunted, falling back. Carter didn't waste time. He was on his feet in seconds, dragging in a deep breath. Then he ran. He caught up with Emma at the back door, yanking it open. Graves's car was waiting outside, engine running. They jumped in as the car sped off. Carter didn't look back. Robert had won this round. He had escaped. But Carter still had the evidence. Emma sat in the therapist's office staring at the floor. The air smelled faintly of lavender, but it did nothing to ease the weight pressing on her chest. The past few days had been a whirlwind. Her parents' rescue, the escape from the estate, the evidence in the USB drive. But the one thing she still didn't have was the full truth. Until now. The therapist spoke in soft, measured tones. "You've been remembering things in pieces, Emma. I want you to take your time, close your eyes if it helps. Let's go back to that night." She swallowed hard and obeyed. The familiar scene played in her mind, the staircase, the dim hallway, the heavy tension in the air. Then she saw him. Robert stood behind her, his face sharp with something she had never seen before, cold intent. His hand reached out, grabbing her arm, and then the shove. Emma's eyes flew open, her breath coming in quick gasps. Tears welled up as the truth hit her like a punch to the gut. "He pushed me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The therapist nodded, her expression steady but kind. "Who pushed you, Emma?" A tear slipped down Emma's cheek. "My uncle." Her hands clenched into fists. He had done it. He had tried to kill her, eliminate her parents, to take everything for himself, and all this time he had played the concerned guardian, hiding in plain sight. Emma buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Carter listened carefully as Emma recounted everything in the conference room at the precinct. He didn't interrupt. He didn't push. When she finished, he let out a slow breath and looked at her parents. "This changes everything," he said. "We have a confession on video, but now we also have a direct witness, James." Davenport nodded. "But that won't stop him," Carter agreed. "Robert had evaded them once. He wouldn't go down without a fight." "We set a trap," Carter said. "We'll leak false intel, make it seem like the US speed drive was destroyed." Claire frowned. Would he believe that? Carter leaned back, tapping his fingers against the table. "He has to. He's desperate. That evidence is the only thing tying him to the crime. If he thinks it's gone, he'll want to make sure for himself." The plan was simple. The department would release staged reports that the USB drive had been deemed inadmissible due to a data corruption error and would be discarded. They would spread the word through contacts in the legal system, ensuring it reached Robert. Then they would wait. Emma's parents agreed to remain under protection. The family wasn't safe, yet not until Robert was behind bars. Now, all they had to do was get him to take the bait. It didn't take long. Robert's movements had been erratic since the escape. His accounts had been flagged, his known associates arrested. He was running out of options, and when he heard about the USB drive, he made his move. Carter and his team were ready. They had stationed officers at the evidence facility, with a fake report had said the drive was being stored. Before destruction, sure enough, just after midnight a figure slipped past the security gates. Carter watched from the monitors in the command van. Robert was cautious, checking his surroundings before heading inside. He moved with urgency, his body tense. He was looking for the evidence. Carter gave the signal. Within seconds, officers flooded the facility, cutting off all exits. Robert barely had time to react before he was surrounded. "Put your hands where I can see them," Carter ordered as he stepped forward. Robert turned slowly, his face twisted with fury. "You think you've won?" Carter remained still. "It's over." Robert's hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand. That money, that leg, why? It was mine. It was never supposed to be his. James never knew how to handle it. He was weak." Carter took a step closer. "And Emma, she was just in your way." Robert's nostrils flared. "She wasn't supposed to remember." His words hung in the air like a final confession. The officers moved in, cuffing him as he thrashed in frustration. Carter watched in silence, knowing that this moment, this arrest was what justice looked like for Emma, for her parents, for the truth that had finally come to light. The interrogation room at the precinct was stark, cold, the walls bare except for a mounted camera blinking steadily in the corner. Carter sat across from Robert, who was still in the same suit he had been arrested in hours earlier. The fabric was wrinkled, his tie loosened. But his composure remained intact, at least for now. Robert leaned back, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You think you've won?" His voice was smooth, practiced. "This is all circumstantial, detective. You're grasping at straws." Carter didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he slid a tablet across the table and pressed play. The grainy security footage flickered to life. The staircase, Emma. And then the moment. The shove, the unmistakable silhouette of Robert sending her over the edge. The smirk faded. "We also have Emma's statement," Carter said. "She remembers now." He leaned forward. Your people are in custody. Your money's frozen. There's nowhere left to run. So why don't you do us both a favor and tell me why? Why go through all of this? Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Robert exhaled sharply, shaking his head before finally speaking. I was supposed to have it all, he muttered, his voice bitter. The estate, the company. Our father promised it to me. Then James came along and suddenly I was the afterthought, the spare son. He let out a hollow laugh. I built my own fortune, but it was never enough. Not after what they took from me. Carter watched as years of resentment cracked through his calm exterior. You tried to kill an 8-year-old girl, Carter said, his voice flat. She was just in the way. Robert spat. Just like James, he never deserved it, any of it. His jaw clenched so I made sure he'd lose everything. Carter sat back, letting the confession settle in. The camera had caught every word, there was no escaping it now. You're done, Carter said, standing. I hope it was worth it. Robert didn't reply. He just sat there staring at the table. The weight of his downfall finally sinking in. The courtroom was silent, except for the rhythm tapping of the judge's gavel. The air was thick with finality as the sentence was read aloud for the charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, and fraud. This court finds the defendant guilty. He is hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Emma sat between her parents, her small hand clenched in her mother's grasp. She didn't cry, she didn't flinch. She just watched as her uncle, once a man she had trusted, was led away in handcuffs, his expression unreadable. It was over. The weight that had been pressing on her chest for months finally lifted. Justice had been served. The estate was no longer a place of shadows. It had taken weeks, but slowly the house that had once felt like a prison was beginning to feel like home again. Emma still had nightmares sometimes, flashes of falling, echoes of voices, but they no longer held her captive. She was safe now. Her father had reassured her every night, and her mother had refused to let her out of her sight. Her family had won the inheritance back, not just the money but their name, their home, their legacy. This time, though, it wasn't about wealth. It was about taking back what had been stolen from them. Carter visited often. Not as a detective, but as a friend. He would sit with Emma on the porch, sipping coffee while she played with the edge of her sweater sleeve. You did good, kid, he told her one afternoon. She shrugged. I just remembered that was the hardest part, Carter said, setting his cup down. You could have been scared. You could have buried it, but you didn't. You fought back. Emma didn't respond immediately. She kicked at a stray pebble with her shoe before looking up at him. What do I do now? She asked. Carter smiled, leaning back in his chair. Anything you want. The wind carried the scent of fresh grass and morning dew as Emma sat by the estate's garden, her sketchbook balanced on her lap. The world felt different now, lighter. She no longer felt like a ghost trapped in her own life. Her parents were still cautious, still rebuilding, but there was laughter in the house again. There were plans for the future. Carter watched from the driveway, hands in his pockets. The case was officially closed, but this one would stay with him. As he turned to leave, Emma looked up and gave him a small wave. He returned it with a nod.